As some of you know, I am a big AUG enjoyer. Season 1 of The War Within was some of the most fun I had playing this game, and after being basically shot in the street and clawing back up to playable, I've got some wishes for AUG in Season 3. Now, AUG is not as bad as people think. I was able to push to like 3350 this season, and I actually picked him back up kind of after the buffs hit and started pushing about halfway through the season. And currently, I'm gearing alt in prep for next season, so I was able to climb fairly quickly in a short amount of time. That being said, let's jump into it. First is something that August dealt with since release, and that is perceived damage. Details does a piss poor job of damage allocation to the AUG, even with the see-through bar attached. It does a terrible job, and it's for a couple of reasons. One, it just doesn't accurately credit the AUG with damage. I know it's got to do with hooks and stuff, and it's not necessarily Details' fault, but it just doesn't do a good job, even with that predicted bar. It's just not accurate. Second, even if it was accurate, it doesn't pull damage from the other DPS. So you can have a situation where you're actually beating DPS on something, but because it doesn't pull from theirs to allocate to yours, it looks like you're not beating them. For example, in a world where the Details predicted bar was accurate, say you were doing 2 million DPS and your prediction bar was putting you at 4 million DPS, and your other DPS, let's say we're in a key, are doing 4 mil DPS each, but 1 mil of their DPS is from you. It doesn't show they're doing 3 mil DPS plus 1 mil buff DPS. It just shows them at 4. So they think that they're tied or beating you, when in reality and on logs, you're ahead of them. Now, this perceived DPS wasn't that big of an issue when AUG was meta, because people generally had played with one long enough to understand that Details was a bad interpretation of AUG damage, and AUG leaned a little more into buff damage than personal damage anyways, so people weren't really expecting it. But I noticed after AUG got buffed a bit and I was actually being invited to groups again, that people had the same misunderstanding, because some people had never played with an AUG, or it had been so long since they played with an AUG, or they thought that AUGs were all personal damage now. They would be doing so much more damage than normal, but see me in last and be like, oh, not enough damage, just for me to check logs and be beating them on the fight that we didn't have enough damage for. So this would be something I would love to see fixed, although it seems extremely unlikely until Blizzard implements their own damage meter, which would allow them access to everything they needed to accurately show it. So I know that they are coming out with one, but until then, I don't think we're going to be able to get that perceived damage as much as I would hope for. Next, I'd like to see prescience be more than what it is right now. Right now in raids, it's really only used to designate ebb and might targets. And in keys, it's just something you keep up because you should, and it feels boring and unimpactful. Never mind the fact that keeping it on a DPS religiously and just sending it with the autocast results in such a minor difference in damage. It's like 1% or something. It doesn't feel like you really need to be using it in any specific way, at least in dungeons. It has its role in raid, but in dungeons, it just feels like you just use it to use it. I would like to see press become a choice node for two variants. One is what it is now, so you could use it in raid as a targeter, and you could still pick your Evan Might targets and all that stuff. While the other one being designated for Mythic Plus, where it would give role-specific buffs. Maybe change its CD to be a little bit longer, but have it buff the healer differently than it buffs the tanks, and have it buff the tanks differently than it buffs the DPS. Maybe it's haste for the healer, or CDR, or just increased healing. Make it a small external for the tank, depending on how long the CD is. Maybe for DPS, it buffs their highest secondary rather than just always crit, so that it benefits every DPS. I think they can make it a longer CD, like 30 to 45 seconds, with a higher impact and dependent on how you use it, so that it feels more impactful when you do use it. Next, I'd like to see Spatial Paradox move somewhere else on the tree, or just become baseline for AUG. It doesn't matter. The real reason would be to free up Time Spiral to become a choice node itself, that on one side would reset movement abilities like it currently does, and the other side, the other node, would be resetting a CC for everyone in your party. I think being able to reset everyone's CC would be extremely valuable. I think it would help in groups with not a lot of CC still be able to handle packs and keys, and this wouldn't be like all their CCs. You're not resetting every sigil on a DH, but maybe it resets Fear Sigil, Thunderstorm for Shamans, Shockwave for Warriors. You get what I'm getting at? It's something that would probably admittedly be a bit OP in the higher keys where people are really coordinated, but people are already talenting for things like mass poly to get extra CCs, to get every CC they possibly can, and figuring out these complex ways to chain CC. And this would just be a simpler way that even in lower keys could be taken advantage of and be hugely beneficial. And one quick one is, can we buff Living Flame? It's our filler spell, and it's ideally we're using it as little as possible. We're using, Eruption in our empowered spells, but towards the end of a pack, when you're not going to be casting Ebb and Might, you don't want to send empowered spells outside of Ebb and Might, so you're just spamming Living Flame. It feels like it does no damage, and I can just watch my damage on the damage meter start winding down. And it hits for like 400k. Can we get like a little buff so that our downtime isn't horrendous compared to our uptime? Next up, threat has been a consistent issue in Season 2 of the War Within. Any class with a big pop of damage tends to be able to pull even after the pack's been fighting for a bit, and I think Timelessness is good for when you have one DPS that's just ripping on pull, but I would love to see it augment blistering scales and increase the threat generated by the buff target. So rather than reducing threat from one target, you buff the tank with blistering scales, and it also increases the threat generated by that target, by the tank. Now, I know threat is a bit more nuanced. It's got a little bit more to play with how tanks deal damage, not necessarily how much threat they're generating in those abilities, but I think this is something that would help. Next, I'd like to see Wing Buffet be a pull-in rather than a knockback. I think knockbacks are generally pretty shit because it spreads the pack out, and if there's casters, they're not coming back in right away. And generally, it feels kind of bad to use because if you use it wrong, then it's one of those like, everyone's like, who did it? Who knocked everyone back? Who just blew this pack up? You're kind of like on the fence to use it. There's some niche uses that it's very, very good. Like in the first pull of Dark Flame Cleft, when he does that knockback that sends everybody flying, you can Wing Buffet everything to his like left side, and then his knockback just literally puts him right into a wall. So there's like niche uses to it. But if it was a pull-in, it would be even better because it wouldn't matter where you really were. As soon as that knockback went off, you would just yank everybody right back in. If you wanted to pull them out of that knockback, you could just position yourself right outside it, pull everybody right out of that knockback. So it's just better in every scenario. Now, this is probably a little bit biased because I'm sure it's used in PvP to create distance, and maybe in open world, if you're trying to save yourself from dying, you knock back the mob and then you get away. So I can't go too hard on this one, but I think tanks without a pull-in generally have a harder time gathering packs, and this could be something that really helps those tanks. Remember, we are a support, right? Now, I could go on, but this is just an 11.2 wish list, so I'm not going to go into like a complete class redesign. But the last thing I want to talk about is something I've wished Augs had forever. I think it would be a super cool ability for both raid and keys, and that ability is Mass Rescue. My idea behind it is that it would take the closest 4 party members and fly to a designated location. I think it'd be sick for raids where you could designate 4 people to stack on the AUG and be flown somewhere for a mechanic. In keys, it would create some sick skips where you could just fly somewhere. And it's something that would have a fairly long cooldown like Shroud or something, so you couldn't do it all the time. But with Scale Commander and the new tier set, I think pack flying is right in line, and it would be super cool to find, little skips and dungeons that you could do that with. All right, that's my wish list for AUG in 11.2. If you hate AUG, make sure to tell me in the comments. And if you like the video and you like AUG, then like the video and subscribe. Until next time, guys.